Hello, I'm W.P. Edmondson and welcome to Focus. Freedom often causes unbelievable silence. Well, you know, Focus' primary objective is to inform, educate, and motivate our viewers to action. It is the election of 2014 will soon be upon us. The legislative session for 2014 just ended. There are a lot of things going on in the world of politics. From state to state, there are things that are going on, things that we never thought we would have to deal with again. So we're going to be talking with an individual that I met in Columbia at the time that the Reverend Dr. William Barber was there in Columbia for the Faith Voices of Columbia's founding convention. I met this gentleman and he had a lot to say, so we want to bring him to you here in Jefferson City and give him an opportunity to share some of the things that is on his mind and some of the things that he's been doing. As just a brief introduction is that, if I can get it here, he is a Reverend Carl Kenney, and he is an adjunct professor at the University of Missouri School of Journalism. He's a former adjunct professor at Duke University Center for Documentary Studies, and he was named the North Carolina top serious columnist for the North Carolina Press Association. And so he has background in journalism. He is an individual who has decided that he has some areas that he has very strong interest in, and so we will be talking about that. And one area that we will focus on very intently is the criminal justice system. Reverend Kenney, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me join you today.
Okay. Well, I shared just a little bit about you. You know, some of those things, when things go wrong, things go wrong. And so I simply could not get onto the internet in time. Everything was going wrong, so I did not get a chance to print out your entire bio. But tell us a little bit more about who you are.
Well, you know, I'm a native of Columbia and left Columbia to attend divinity school at Duke University back in the late 80s. Graduated from Duke and became pastor of the Orange Grove Missionary Baptist Church in Durham, North Carolina. So I've served as a journalist on both broadcast, print, magazine, newspaper, print, magazine work, and also PR, and worked as an activist in the North Carolina area for over a 30-year period. And relocated to this area to primarily take care of my dad, and have landed worked there at the University of Missouri, working in journalism and also doing some ministry, some supply preaching from time to time. It's an interesting transition coming back to Missouri. While in North Carolina, I was able to connect with the Moral Monday movement, and I think we met with Reverend Barber's coming to Durham. Barber and I were colleagues in North Carolina. We both were graduates of the same divinity school, and so we had connection and friendship over the years, and really proud of the positions he's taken around a myriad of issues. So that's why I'm here, trying to take care of my parents and find a place.
Okay. Speaking of Reverend Barber, he is very passionate about the Moral Monday movement, and he is quick to say that he is not the leader of the movement. And so how do you characterize Dr. Barber, who he is, and why he's doing what he's doing?
Well, I think the movement is bigger than a person, and the Reverend Barber is part of a generation that has been hindered after the loss of great leadership. And I think that Reverend Barber is really insightful around the need to construct a way of talking about activism that is not person-driven. We've seen that with the death of many of our historical leaders. You know, they die, the movement dies. Reverend Barber is very aware of the need to build beyond that. And he surrounded himself with highly capable people from a variety of disciplines, theologians, economic-centered people, people who are lawyers. There's a large body of people that have been working for a long time around constructing a way of communicating this type of work. I think it would be wise for people across the nation to look at that, because it's not person-driven, it's definitely not emotion-driven. It's rooted in an idea, and that is that we are people of faith who are grounded in an idea that all of us are created with a level of dignity that needs to be celebrated, and our public policies need to affirm that. So I would say that although a lot of the attention is on Reverend Barber, that if you were to take a real critical gaze at it, it's much, much bigger than one person. And there are a lot of people who have gone to jail in support of what has been happening within that community for a period of time now.
Why do you think North Carolina was fertile ground for such a movement in times such as this?
Well, you know, the hostility around the politicians who were contrary, the contrary-minded politicians in North Carolina were just really out of control around the creation of policy that took us way, way back to an era that we worked really, really hard to overcome. So when it came to policies like voting rights, the redistricting of voting districts, and taking away people's basic voting rights, and then policies that really came after the poor, it was so brutal that people around the state had to rise in opposition to that. And what we found, the miracle of the Moral Monday movement, is it transcended race. You know, those who showed up initially were not black. You know, it's quite intriguing that the primary policies impacted people of color, black, brown people, poor people, you know, people marginalized. But those who showed up to protest were not. There are people who had common sense enough to understand that these type of policies were hurting people. And so it happened in North Carolina because the actions were so vicious. I mean, just so vicious against women's rights, against rights of African Americans, Latino, Hispanic and Latinos, and people incarcerated, people poor, with people with no health care. You know, just a wide range of policies that came under attack, or attacked people who were impacted by those type of policies.
Reverend Barber indicated that the initial movement grew out of 17 individuals.
Right.
What does that say about how things get started, and you don't necessarily have to have hundreds of thousands of people to get something started that really address serious issues?
I think that what it says is it's bigger, again, than a person. Barber is a very charismatic leader. He's a very gifted orator. But the thing that galvanized was the policy. The people who gathered, the 17 people who gathered, they were meeting prior to the radical shift within the state government. You know, they were gathering around a couple of issues that we wanted to take a look at. And they gathered primarily because of Barber's role with the NAACP. And then what happened is things began to really change around public policies, and other people showed up in response to that. And once people began to go to jail, that particular movie was really exciting to watch. And it very teary-eyed moments when you watch young people who many people have given up on the youth, with college students who are showing up, who want to go to jail, demanding to go to jail, who want to speak out around how these type of decisions are impacting them. And so again, I think that when you have policies that are exposed for what they really are, and then you have the counter action to that, where people refuse to hear it, I think the governor's response in North Carolina, the state legislature's response to the protests just forced even greater retaliation among those who were hoping they would listen. And it didn't happen that way. And so the push against it all made it more accessible to people who were just tired of it.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of getting arrested, you have a keen interest in the criminal justice system. Mm-hmm. How did that come about that you decided that this needed your attention?
Well, I think that anybody who wants to look at the dynamics within our society that polarize people of color, Richard Nixon in 1970s made a statement to Haldeman that was caught in the tapes, the presidential tapes, where there was this private conversation where he stated that we need to create a way to control the black people, paraphrasing. We need to create a way to keep black people in their proper place without them knowing we're doing so. And from that conversation, there was construction of the DEA in 1973. When we look at what's happening to fracture black men in our country, the fact that you currently have 2 million beds, prison beds are being built in the United States. So over the next 5 years or less, there'll be 2 million more places for black men and brown men to be housed, and they're not there. So we begin to understand that the prison system has become business. It is privatized. It's become very profitable, and people like Michelle Alexander, the new Jim Crow, have in a very critical way, looking at history and the best of the scholarship around this particular issue, have been able to communicate that there is an all-out assault on our men, and it's impacting the black family. It impacts economic base. It impacts the quality of life for many people. Therefore, it is one of the major issues confronting America is how we allowed massive incarceration of a group of men, and the disparity in the incarceration rates for black men, brown men versus European men, white men, is so disparate that we have to begin to have that kind of conversation in a way that's healthy and redemptive and constructive in shifting it. The fact that you can go on the stock market and buy stock in prisons really speaks to the fact that it is a business, and to have businesses you have to have customers, and those customers are black and brown men. It's a very important issue.
So we're basically talking about a systematic approach that has been designed with a callous intent that impact a segment of the population.
Well, we're living in a capitalistic society, and you have to look at the profit margin. That this is profitable, and it. I would think that initially, I think that in a part of some, it was probably intentional. I think what's happening is it's now fueled by racism. It's fueled by the assumptions people make about black men and brown men. We're viewed as violent. You see that with Trayvon Martin and other cases where black men are accused of crime before crimes happen. And that's part of the psyche of America now, that these men need to be incarcerated. And therefore, it has become systematic. It probably began as part of a mindset that public policies need to be attached in a way that can control this increasing movement toward crime. We can blame a lot of people for it. We can blame Nixon. We can probably blame the Reagan administration, but we also blame Bill Clinton for the altering of the penalties for crack cocaine sales versus powder cocaine, the disparity between the two. was a definite attack on the black community in the 1980s, where we saw a rise in crack cocaine that was placed within the black community, and many believe that that was intentional. I think it's hard to argue against that, that our communities have been devastated in a way that makes you wonder if it is an intentional ploy on the part of some people to destroy the livelihood of people of color. That's a conversation for the social scientists. It's also a conversation for historians. But when we think about public policy and how these particular decisions can impact in the long run, when you make these type of decisions, it has implications, and it's time for us to look at those and begin to think about some of those changes. And I think the president has looked at that, along with Holder, Attorney General Holder, looking at changing some of the penalties for some of these crimes to help these men out.
Attorney Michelle Alexander, in the book, The New Jim Crow,
Right.
Reading that book, before you even get to the first chapter,
Right.
You have been enlightened
Right.
as to nothing in this system is by accident.
Correct.
And I guess the thing that captured me was that the fact that being able to track it all the way back as to how things occur based upon a preconceived notion
Right.
drives things much more often than people understand.
Correct. Well, I think that it is fueled in part by the national ideal around race, race when it's cloaked in black male skin. There are assumptions about the violence of the black man that is generated in part by the portrayals in the media, in our cinema. There are ideas around black manhood that feed into the hostility and feed into the idea that more needs to be done, that we need to be tough on crime. You go back to the administrations preceding the current administration, we find a lot of language about being tough on crime, being tough on crime, and how laws are put in place that really speak to that, being tough on crime. In North Carolina, the Racist Justice Act was put in place because it became very clear through the research and through the actual research that there was a disparity between the incarceration and penalties of black men versus white men, and that when you look at those who face execution, that it can be seen that their cases were not fair cases, that the juries were tainted by race, that not only the juries were tainted by race, but their attorneys and the prosecution, they make prejudgments based on how race plays a part in that. And so in the cases of those who are on death row, we see that parallel. And in other cases, we see the same, where there are men who are incarcerated who may actually be innocent. We see the evidence of that with people like Daryl Hunt, who faced a death sentence, life sentence for rape that he did not commit. The DNA evidence comes out and it proves it to be the case. So yeah, the race plays a part in that. And part of the fight in North Carolina was when the legislature came back and they decided to repeal the Racial Justice Act, despite the evidence that there's that disparity between incarceration of black men, brown men versus white. They didn't care. And I do believe that we can see how all of this plays out when we look at the incarceration of black men versus other races, that a lot of that has to do with the way juries think about it. It has a lot to do with the prosecution and the defense attorneys and the kind of prejudgments that lead to all of that. And all of it needs to be looked at in a way that could shift the vast difference between black male incarceration and the rest of the general population.
And not to cast any aspersions upon public defenders. Public defenders is a difficult job, but at the same time, money plays a tremendous role. And if you can afford a very good attorney who's doesn't have the caseload
Right.
that a public defender have, it means a lot as far as your defense is concerned. How do you go about looking at, I heard you spoke a little bit about the fact that not only are we talking about incarceration, but we also are speaking on the impact of incarceration after those individuals get out of prison. Speak to that.
Well, it happens in a number of ways. One is what we call the box. You know, there's a box that those who have criminal records are required in some cases to check whether or not they have a criminal record, and how that plays out in their ability to locate employment. So there's a discrimination against those who have paid their price. They paid their dues to society by serving the sentence, and they're constantly being resentenced when they look for work. And you have a number of cases of men that I've actually had conversations with. I'm passionate about this particular issue because of the way it impacted me as a person in ministry and serving members of the congregation who have husbands incarcerated, who have sons and being incarcerated, and how the system is set up to re-incarcerate those who get out by their inability to find work, the frustration that follows the inability to get work, and then ended up in a lifestyle that isn't common to that which led them into prison, and getting got caught up all over and over again. I think as part of what we have to look at is, what does it mean to be rehabilitated? You know, are we taking seriously the idea of rehabilitation in our society? Or are we wanting to continue to punish those who have served their time? And what happens while they serve the time? Are we merely wanting to punish them, or to offer them the kind of support that allows them to find employment and have the kind of quality of life and be introduced to their families? And some of that may even mean receiving some form of psychological care for the men and women who are incarcerated due to mental illness or some form of substance abuse. What level of support are they receiving to keep them from going back again?
Tell me if I'm correct. Legislatures throughout this country are taking a look at the incarceration now.
Right.
And it's not about the injustice of it all, but more or less budget. It's costing the state more money to incarcerate folks. So now they're looking at, well, are we spending too much on prisons? Not so much as, why are we locking up so many people? But it's a budget matter. Have you ever given that any kind of thought?
Well, you know, I don't. I think that many of our prisons are privatized. They're no longer being managed by the state. They're being managed by companies who are set up to make profit. They do a good job of downsizing the workforce and not providing the kind of care that the prisoners need. I do agree that it's a budget issue, that incarceration is budget connected. It's profit driven. It is a business. It's a big business. It's big profit, and stocks show that to be the case. I think that whenever you have the state in bed with a private company, and when the state makes a decision to get out of the business of imprisonment by handing it over to a private company, the outcome cannot be positive, because it becomes a business. And those businesses are in the business of having more customers, which means that it's going to be fueled by a system that needs for it to exist. Everybody connected to that, from that system to the prosecution, to the defense, to the judges, to those who work in the prison, it all feeds upon the profit of that particular system. And we need to look at how the capital connected to incarceration has influence around those sentences. I think that's the bigger issue here. I think the states are making profit through privatizing and selling out these contracts to these private companies, and they're going to make it work in a way that keeps folk incarcerated who may not deserve to be there. And that's the issue. I think that's the bigger question.
Yeah. And I guess the other thing here is that as the dollars flow downward, it goes all the way down to the police department in the little small towns.
Right.
If they can receive some dollars to help build a jail or equip them or whatever, you know, coming from the lobbyists, then they're going to find reason to lock more people up.
You see a radical shift in small communities who at one time would fight to keep a prison out of their community. I mean, they fight against it because of the assumptions about those incarcerated, you know, the fear of people getting loose, those kind of things. So they fight against it. But now you have these communities who have struggling incomes, you know, economies on the down, who are fighting for state contracts to build prisons so they can have an economy that will fuel their communities. So that right there will show you that the entire conversation around incarceration is been taken completely out of the realm of creating places to, you know, pit people to what kind of profit are we going to make, and that's the real issue.
Coming to a close, how would you compare North Carolina and Missouri when it comes to political systems, issues?
Yeah. I think Missouri and North Carolina have some things in common. They're both agrarian kind of societies. You have large bodies of farmland that creates a kind of political fervor in both. The primary difference between the two is the demographics are different. North Carolina has large pockets of urban centers, be it Durham, Raleigh, be it Greensboro, Winston-Salem, Charlotte, the large pockets of people of color and with the urban kind of issues. I think Missouri, the politics of Missouri, it seems it's quiet here when it comes to some of the issues. I've been startled at how quiet it remains. There's not a lot of activity around the protests of certain issues in the state. And I think it has a lot to do with the way it's spread out. And the populations impacted by it are so distant from one another that you don't hear large bodies of people coming to speak out in a way that you would have in North Carolina. I also think that the tendency in North Carolina to be bigoted is a little bit more severe because of the large bodies of bigoted-minded people. They're more vocal with it. It's more covert here. The bigotry is real in Missouri, but it's covered under a political agenda that makes it seem nicer. But it's the same kind of political violent activity that you will see in North Carolina. There is the big differences, but there are commonalities. I'm waiting to see what happens as the General Assembly in Missouri becomes more violent-based around voting rights and taking those rights away from people. What kind of energy will go into shifting what I see coming down the pipe? Okay.
As the closing question here, looking at the impact of citizens having the right to vote, the impact that has on the people that end up in office. And unfortunately, far too many people decide that off-season elections are not important, local elections are not important, the presidential election, that's very important.
Right.
You know, but the fact is, every election is important.
Correct.
In closing remarks, how do you speak to those individuals about the importance of that vote And when they say my vote doesn't count.
Well, I think it's up to the press, people like yourself, people like me, to communicate the way these decisions correlate to the day-to-day activity of those individuals. I don't think people make those connections. I think it's up for us to communicate what those connections look like. You know, some of this stuff is very complicated for persons who are not formally educated, for people not sophisticated when it comes to being able to read between the lines. Mm-hmm. And so they see an election, they see a vote on a particular subject, and they're not able to make the connection of what that means. As a column writer, I think that one of the tragedies that we have in what a number of our local papers is they're moving away from commentary. They're feeding people the story, but they're not getting the commentary to really flesh out what it means for these type of votes to take place. So I do believe the press is to blame for some of that. We're expecting the people to know what that means, and they're not sophisticated enough to do it. It takes people like us to say that when the General Assembly votes this way, this is what that means, and this are the consequences to your table, to your ability to be employed. That's what I think needs to happen. Mm-hmm. We need more of the press that's willing to tell that side of that story.
Okay. Well, we've been talking with the Reverend Kenney. He's a journalist, professor at the University of Missouri. He hails from Columbia, but he had spent a lot of time in North Carolina. And he is an acquaintance and a colleague of the Reverend Dr. William Barber, who was here in Columbia a few months ago. We hope that something we've said this evening will in fact impact you, thinking about the fact that nothing is by accident, nothing happens by accident. There's usually a reason behind it. And when you talk about politicians, politicians are driven by their constituents. If you don't speak, they do what they wish to do. So we're asking you to speak out. The faith community has in fact stood up, and we will continue to stand up in this community and this state. When the legislature comes back, we'll be there. Matter of fact, we are already here. We'll see you next time. God bless.